Okay, friend, welcome back. In this lesson, I want to share my history with money and how this budgeting muscle that we're going to be building together has actually released me from my former worries about money. My purpose in sharing my own story is to add what I hope is a personal dimension to this course centered around how I used this budgeting skill set to completely change the trajectory of my own financial life and, more importantly, how you can do it too. Now that I've slayed my debt and built a moderate degree of financial independence, I actually love sharing my story. But I can promise you it wasn't always that way. In fact, during the time that I was drowning in debt, I experienced a lot of guilt and shame about my story and wasn't really all that keen in airing my financial laundry to my friends, family, and let alone to the entirety of the interwebs. So I wanted to briefly outline the progression of my transformation before we jump into the actual story to see if you can identify where you might be in your process. I made a lot of poorly considered financial decisions based on cultural assumptions and what I saw around me. These bad decisions caused me to worry about money as though it was my job. It actually kind of was my job. You may be here partially because you've heard parts of my financial catastrophe story. I had a real money crisis and it broke me deeply. Then a light bulb went off. And I discovered the right principles and I got help. Then I made sacrifices like going back into corporate America and putting my beloved music career in the back seat for a season. Then finally, I freed myself completely. Okay, so that's the general outline. Let's walk through the story in a little bit more detail. How it all came crashing down. For most of my life, I really had no idea how money worked, and I actually kind of hated anything that had to do with the subject. And as I sort of blindly groped my way into adulthood, it became clear that I just wasn't going to be very good with it. And if you knew my backstory, this would be seen as kind of surprising given the fact that growing up, my mom put a constant and vocal emphasis on the virtue and practice of frugality. My mom was excellent at being frugal. A sort of frugal queen, you might say. But I think our relative poverty and the feeling that money was this sort of hyper scarce resource that only those seemingly rich people always seem to have more than enough of really kind of cast a long, dark shadow on my perception of frugality at that particular time in my life. So I grew up, graduated from high school, went into the Army, entered college, and through osmosis, adopted all the middle-class attitudes about money. Like, man, just throw it on the card. You'll make good money. You can just pay it off later. Dude, you'll always have a car payment. You'll always have credit card debt. I mean, really, how does anyone actually get through college without student loans unless they're born with like a silver spoon? So with that as a background, in this lesson, I want to outline how learning this pivotal skill of budgeting absolutely transformed my life. And more specifically, I want to share how I paid off $174,000 in 2.5 years, worked my way to financial independence in another 5 years, and how you can use the contents of this course to get control of your own money for good. So I graduated from college, got a fantastic job in Yellow Pages advertising sales, back when that was still a thing, and proceeded to completely suppress everything my mom had tried to teach me about money growing up. And it took about 5 years, a horrendous divorce, a dead-end corporate sales job, the second of many, unfortunately, and a move to a brand new city where I didn't know anyone for me to hit rock bottom and be forced to face my financial music, pun intended. Now let's talk about the well-known statistic and how I became a part of it. So you've probably heard the statistic that 78% of the population lives paycheck to paycheck and would have trouble coming up with $400 for an emergency. If you haven't, welcome to one of the harshest financial realities in America. Now, think about that for a second. Isn't it crazy that quite literally 8 out of every 10 people we interact with on a daily basis live paycheck to paycheck, and many would have a hard time covering that $400 emergency? How is that possible? 78%. That's crazy. Actually, I know how because I personally lived it. My decidedly torturous season of paycheck to paycheck living started after I went through that horrendously painful divorce I mentioned earlier and relocated from sunny South Florida to Atlanta, Georgia to start a new life and to try to remove myself from the immediate environment that had reminded me of all the painful memories I just spent about a decade accumulating. And I did remove myself from some of those painful memories, sort of. But But in doing that, I unwittingly used my newfound lucrative advertising sales career to learn just how to embody all the middle class attitudes I outlined earlier. Man, just throw it on the card. You can make good money. You can just pay it off later. Dude, you always have a car payment. You always have credit card debt. How does anybody get through college without student loans? All the things that we hear all the time. What I was actually doing, though, was I was using my new city and new network to drown my sorrows in increasingly corrosive financial decisions, both large and small. So let me explain some examples of what I mean by corrosion. I leased a brand new, top of the line, black on black, decked out Honda Accord. I bought a high-end downtown Atlanta condo that was really out of my price range. And I lavished my friends with dinners and gifts and generally lived like I was just gonna keep making more and more money indefinitely. The problem was, on top of the unrelenting grieving process I was trying my best to avoid with retail therapy, I actually hated my job. Really hated it. Even though it was the most lucrative job I'd ever had, and I knew that if I could learn to stomach the job, the company, and all its bureaucratic and political nonsense, I could continue to make even more money. But that strategy of hope just wasn't going to work. In April of 2001, still grieving, still completely lost, I quit my corporate sales job to pursue my long-standing dream career of being a full-time musician. And while I still believe in some ways that it was the right move emotionally, psychologically, and even career-wise for that stage of my life, the financial part of it was just not jiving, at all. Almost overnight, I went from multiple five-figure paychecks per month to, well, as they say, peanuts, and I was not prepared for it in any way. No budget, no savings, and a HELOC as my emergency fund. That's a home equity line of credit for those of you lucky enough to never have had one. So suddenly I was living hand to mouth in dealing with the painful consequences of not learning how to be responsible with my money. And so the following 3 years saw my financial and emotional life devolve into paycheck to paycheck living in a whopping $174,000 worth of debt that culminated in my hitting absolute rock bottom in the winter of 2004. What rock bottom revealed? Rock bottom showed me a bunch of things about myself. Rock bottom was the clearest, cleanest, most precise mirror I had ever looked into. It showed me that I had to change, and I had to change right then, in that moment, no delay. Because my home equity line of credit was maxed out, there was literally nothing left for me to hide behind anymore. In real terms, that meant that my $43,000 HELOC was totally tapped out by 1, paying off my leased car, and 2, buying music gear I needed for my career, and 3, ultimately to cover living expenses due to the extreme shortfall in my income. And on top of it all, that $131,000 mortgage was something I just couldn't afford as a monthly recurring expense at that time. And even though I was emotionally destroyed and completely beat down, there was a strange sense of hope I felt. I had recently discovered Dave Ramsey's platform, and I had started dabbling, and it began to give me a glimmer of hope that I actually could climb out of this deep, dark crater of debt and desperation that I so carelessly constructed for myself. It was totally my fault. So filled with this odd sense of hope, I decided that I would, very reluctantly, venture back into corporate sales for a season as a primary job, keep my music career as a kind of side hustle, and work like a madman to pay down this debt so that I could ride off into the sunset to my gloriously conceived music career. So I updated my resume, put it out there, and to my incredible surprise, almost immediately got 2 job interviews and 2 solid offers. And I was like, I couldn't believe it. So long story short, I took a job with a pretty well-known software company that produced a contact management software, what later would become CRM or customer relationship management software, and proceeded to work like a madman. In short order, and due in no small part to the energy of my complete desperation, I became the top salesman in the office, rookie salesman of the year for the company, and proceeded to crush all of their previously held company sales records. This was a whole new realm for me. Rock bottom was a harsh wake-up call, but it was giving me some explosive rocket fuel. So you might be asking the question, what does this all have to do with budgeting, Brad? And why am I going into such detail about my own personal financial train wreck? That is a great question, and I'll start by saying that it has everything to do with budgeting. Once I started to get my head together and really embrace what would become my own 8 Steps to Erase Debt program, I started to feel a sense of hope around my money that I had never felt before in my life. Frugality finally clicked. My mom's long-held discipline of frugality was now being cast in a perfectly well-lit, solid gold picture frame. Once I got some basic financial organization of my bills, expenses, and debts into a centralized document and then populated my first basic budget, the momentum really began to build. I started to see that this process of coming clean wasn't going to be as difficult as I was making it up in my mind for it to be. I started to see that having some clarity around where my money was coming from and, more importantly, where it was going brought a new sense of peace that I'd never come close to perceiving when it came to money. Now, just like most people, the first few months were rocky. But I had determined in my mind that pushing past any of the pain and fear, along with some instruction and coaching and community, was already paying huge dividends for me, even at the early stages, and I was totally hooked. Long story short, I organized, optimized, learned how to budget, and properly track expenses to the tune of paying off every last penny of that $174,000 worth of debt. Again, $43,000 in consumer debt, $131,000 in mortgage debt in just 2.5 years. And what's even better than that is that I 100% credit the budgeting muscle I built during that time with being the pivotal force that helped my wife and me build an over $700,000 net worth in under a decade. The budget has been my wife's and my external brain, our disaster repellent, our lifestyle creep warning light, and most importantly, our key tool for financial solvency, debt elimination, and now financial independence. It is 100% accurate for me to say that my wife and I, 1, have never fought about money for our entire marriage, and 2, just don't count money as one of our worries. Not because we're fabulously wealthy, but rather because we have a very solid grasp on our financial trajectory thanks to our constant companion, our budget, our external brain. So my mom's way of thinking won out in the end. I just had to learn, as they say, the hard way. And this is what I want so badly for you. Without the hard part, of course. So now that you have some juicy details about the perfectly imperfect instructor of this course, let's talk about where all of this starts, because after all, I want for you to get to the place where you don't worry about money anymore. But before we move to the next module, please make sure to give us some feedback on this one in the feedback time, tell us your thoughts section. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next lesson.